In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a clean painted cinder block texture completely from scratch, entirely inside Substance 3D Painter. This way you don't have to get any from the marketplace, and there aren't that many that are clean painted cinder block textures to use, and you do not have to use Substance Designer or Sampler in order to have this material. And I will share a lot of tips, tricks, and techniques that can be used for any other materials you're going to be working on. So let's begin. Before we get started, if you're looking to learn Substance Painter completely from scratch and you want to learn everything to get started to texture new meshes, I created an in-depth tutorial course that will show you everything you need to know in only 6 hours across 23 videos in Substance 3D Painter Essentials. The course is available right now for you to pick up, to watch, and to learn. And now, onto the tutorial. So here I have a scene set up. It is a tile and plane with a scale mannequin for judging scale of the textures and the cinder block size. And if you want to see how I set this up, I have a tutorial that breaks this down step by step. So the first thing we're going to do is to create a fill layer with a black mask that will contain a brick generator that will allow us to define the size of each cinder block and their position. And this brick generator is included with Substance Painter. So let's create a fill layer. Then for this fill layer, I'm going to right click on the icon and create a black mask. And inside this black mask is where we're going to add that brick generator texture. And this will be our mask to define the cinder block repetition. I'm then going to right click on the black mask and create a fill into the black mask. And this fill effect will allow us to now come down to the grayscale property and add a grayscale texture. So we need a brick generator texture. You can left click on this grayscale icon and then search for brick, and this is the one we're going to use right here, brick generator. Or you can come over to the left hand side, click over to textures, this icon right here, search for brick, and it will also pop up, and you can left click, hold and drag and just drop it into the grayscale property. And now you have a brick generator to use. Now we will not be able to see this on our mesh yet. That's because we need to see the mask and what it's doing, because we have no other layers to use this mask on at the moment. So we can use this drop down menu in the viewport, choose over to mask. Or another option is if you alt left click on the black mask itself, this will also display what the mask is doing. So this will allow us to define some parameters and properties for the brick generator. So let's go ahead and zoom in a little closer, and I'm going to get close enough so I can see the scale mannequin as a reference so I know how big to make those cinder blocks. And this helps a lot to define that initial scale of the texture. Let's click over to the brick generator fill effect, come down to the properties, and if you go to the pattern section, open that up, you have all the options you ever need to define the repetition of these bricks. Now you can go ahead and just start changing these sliders, see what they do, and define the repetition and how each cinder block will look. Now I already have these numbers written down, so you don't have to sit there and watch me tweak all of these in real time. And instead I'm just going to input the values, and you can use the same ones, or you can just go through and define each one of these yourself based on what type of cinder block repetition you're looking for. So I'm going to start at the top. So for histogram position and contrast, I'll leave these at default. The pattern for brick X and brick Y, this is the amount of bricks. So for X, I'm going to input 7, and for bricks Y, 12. And this gives me pretty good size for each cinder block. Then for bevel X and Y, I'm going to lower these a lot so they're not as soft edged as they are by default. So bevel X is going to be 0.02, and bevel Y is also going to be 0.02. And now let's go ahead and zoom in. And we got some nice cinder block repetition going now. For gap X and Y, right here, I'm going to increase these slightly. So for gap X, I have 0.02, and for gap Y, 0.03. And everything else I keep at default. Again, there's a lot of properties here, so you can just start messing around with these and see what you can come up with for your cinder block repetition. But this is what we're going to use for this tutorial. Next, we're going to introduce a filter and effect that will allow us to break up these straight lines. Otherwise, it's not going to look realistic. So we need to distort this a little bit. And we're going to do this with a filter. Come over to the black mask again, right click on the icon, and this time we're going to add a filter. And then come down to the properties and use a blur slope filter. Let's type in blur. A few blur filters will come up, and we're going to use the blur slope. This will allow us to input a grayscale image to distort those edges. And as soon as you use it, we already have that edge distortion happening. So we can use some of these properties and increase or decrease the intensity of it. We can zoom in a little closer so we can see. But I want to use a custom grunge image instead of this default. So let's go to the source parameters, and under source type, let's choose custom noise. Once selected, scroll down a little further and you'll see image input for custom noise. And this will allow you to use a custom grunge map. Left click on it and search for grunge. And then just choose the grunge that you would want to use. So let's say I input this one, but then you can come back up and just kind of mess around with the intensity on all the other properties. And you can see that it's going to begin to distress those edges on the mask and introduce a little bit more realistic separation of straight lines. I do, however, have an image in mind already that I kind of picked out by simply testing out a bunch until I found the right one. So the one that I like and the one I'm going to use is BNW spots. So let me type in spots, and it's BNW spots 1, this one right here. And it creates a nice effect. So then let's come back up and just mess around with the properties. So increase or decrease the intensity. I don't want this to be too intense. I just want to break up the edges a little bit. Again, this is going to be more of a modern painted cinder block texture. So I don't want to have this too damaged. Just enough to kind of break those up and make it a little bit more real. Again, zoom out based on the view that the player is going to see. So right about there. Let's lower this. So basically you would just go through and find the right values for the intensity to use. If you need more control over the custom noise image you're using, it does have balance and contrast for you to adjust, as well as the ability to invert for a different effect. And then to add on top of that, you can duplicate this filter and then change the custom noise to something else, and this will add on to the effect. So let me show you how to do that. Let's take the blur slope. We'll now right click on it and choose copy effect, and then right click on it again and then paste the effect. So now we have blur slope 1, blur slope 2. And for the top one, I'm just gonna come down to custom image noise and change it to something else. And again, you can look through any of the grunge textures. I do, however, have one in mind already, and it's grunge plaster cracked. And it's this one right here. Again, let me come back up to the intensity and just lower this to a very low amount. If you don't want to lower these values to their triple decimals, you can increase the intensity divider by a higher value. So let's say 100. So you can see by increasing this, you're not going to get those triple decimals. Let's do 1000. So the values are going to be a little bit more easier to work with. And if you want to see what the filter is doing before and after, just hide the icon for visibility. That way you can see the before and after. So this adds an additional filter effect to break up those edges even further. And you can also change the blend mode for each of these filters by coming over here to the drop down menu for replace. That's the default right now, and you can change to any of these blend modes for that specific filter, and you'll get a different result of what that filter is doing. I'm going to change it to normal. So just go through the settings for each of the filters. You don't have to use 2. I just like using 2 for this option because it breaks up those edges a little further. And adjust the properties for each of these blur slope filters to get the desired effect. So for reference, just so you know what I did change the blur slope for both of these in the properties, the blend mode from blur to minimum. It just gave me the better effect that I was looking for. Let's go ahead and zoom in. And I did the same thing for the first blur that we created. I changed the blending mode from blur to minimum. Just kind of clears up those edges a little bit more. Again, it's all a matter of what you're looking for just by messing around with the settings. And then I also want to add a filter on top of all of this, which is going to be a basic blur filter. So these edges right here that we are using the blur slope on sometimes can be a little too harsh, and adding an additional blur to blur those edges can help. And we'll be able to come back down the stack after we have some color and some height applied and just kind of tweak these properties further. So this is a non-destructive method you can always come back to and adjust. But I do like to add an additional blur to this, just to blur these edges a little bit more. And in the end, it does create a little bit better effect of this mask. So I'm going to come back up to the mask itself, right click on it and add a filter. And this filter is going to be regular blur. Now the default blur intensity is going to be way too much. And I'm going to lower this to 0.1. So if I zoom in a little closer, it just blurs those edges more. Just slightly. In your case, you may or may not need it. And last step for this adjustment, for this mask creation, we're going to create an anchor. And what an anchor is a reference point for this mask that we'll be able to use anywhere else within the stack of our layer creation. So instead of having to create this mask setup for every single one of the future layers, we'll be able to just use this mask anywhere along the stack in any layer without having to recreate this setup. It's an extremely useful way to call on what you've already created and reuse it. So I'm gonna right click on the black mask and create anchor point right here on the bottom. And let's rename it brick painted anchor. And let's also rename the layer. So it's no longer fill layer. This is going to be brick painted mask. So what we just did is create a mask, adjusted all the properties for the cinder block of how we would want that mask to look. And now we can call upon this mask using this anchor point we created in any additional layers that we create. Now let's go ahead and create the color and the height for the bricks, for the cinder blocks themselves. Let's switch back to material and let's create a folder. We're going to contain everything inside the folder, and it'll be easier to reference this anchor point of the black mask for the folder itself and everything that's contained in it. So I'm going to create a folder, and let's name this folder painted bricks. So we'll have a folder and all the controls for the blocks, for the cinder blocks themselves. And then we'll also have another folder for the grout, the in-between cinder blocks material. And we'll contain both of those into their own folders. It'll be easier to work with. Now inside this folder, let's create a fill layer. This fill layer is going to be our painted brick color. Let's rename it to painted brick. With it selected, let's go to the materials, to the channels, and adjust the base color. So for this painted brick, I want it to be off-white, something like this. If you were taking this into Unreal Engine 5, it's best to keep your default color more of a neutral gray. It'll be easier to change to any other color inside Unreal without having to color mix. If you set a color now, when you start adding a certain color inside Unreal, then you're not going to get desired effect. So I like to keep my materials, the base material, more to a neutral color. It makes it easier to adjust color inside Unreal instead. So I'm going to choose the soft white. And let's set our roughness. So let me move my camera around until we see. So for this initial roughness, I just want to bump it up to 0.4. Painted cinder blocks a little bit more shiny. But we'll come back to the roughness. We have a lot of adjustments to make for the roughness channel itself. So this is our base color. Now I want to add some height, so that way we have that detail on the cinder block. Now I don't want to have this within our base color painted brick layer. I want to have it as a separate layer. We could add a height right here into the properties and use some kind of a grunge map. And this will work. You can see that it's applying it. However, I want to have separate controls for it in its own individual fill layer. So let me undo this, and then instead of doing it within base color, fill layer that we created, I'm going to add a new fill layer. And let's rename it to brick, or let's do painted brick height. And then the properties, we're going to disable everything but height. So we're only working with the height channel. And then instead of inputting our grunge map into this height, instead I'm going to create a black mask. This will give us more control over adjusting that height property. So by right clicking on the fill layer, I'm going to add a black mask to it. And then inside this black mask, I'm going to right click and add a fill. This gives us the property to add the grayscaled grunge texture. And then now I just need to input a grunge texture that I want to use for that height information. So again, you can just go ahead and pick one out that you'd want to use. You're not going to see any results for it. So you can kind of judge which one you would want to use. And that is because we need to adjust a couple of properties. First, we need to come back to the fill layer and then add the height. Right now it's set to 0, that's why we don't see anything. So let's increase this to a specific value. Let's do 0.1, and you're going to start seeing the results right here. So if I increase it, you can see it. So this way we can always come back into this height property and adjust the intensity of that grunge grayscale texture being used. Let's go back to the grayscale itself, and you just simply find the one you'd want to use. I have one in mind already, and it's not the medium grunge concrete moss, but small. Grunge concrete moss small, and it's this one right here. But you can find whichever one you'd want to use for your cinder block texture height. So again, just zoom in and just see what it would look like. Now we don't have the bricks themselves that we can kind of compare to what that individual cinder block will look like. So this is where the anchor point comes in. And in order to call upon this anchor that we created and use this mask inside the painted brick folder layer and all the layers within it, select the folder that we created, right click on it, add a black mask. This will mask and hide everything within that folder. Then right click on the black mask and create a fill. And then once you have your fill, come down to the grayscale property, select the grayscale as if you were inputting a texture, but instead switch over to the anchor points and use the brick painted anchor we created. And this will call upon the brick painted mask and all the properties that we created and use it for this layer, for this folder and all the layers within it. And you can see how powerful this is. Since we created it once, we can just now reference it for this folder. And now we can zoom in and just continue to adjust. So let's go back into the painted brick height, into that grunge fill effect. Again, you can choose another grunge to use. You can adjust the balance, adjust the contrast. In our case, I'm going to come back to the brick height itself and lower the height of the fill layer because this is too much. Let's do 0.1. And also, looks like I may need to increase the scale of the grunge texture we are using. So let's come back to our fill grunge we are using. Come back up here, you have tiling, and let's increase it to 2. So we are now tiling and increasing the repetition of the grayscale. So let's do maybe 3 and just kind of compare it to this human reference scale. This is why I like using this, because now I can tell how much of the scale that I need to increase for that detail of each cinder block. And I think that's pretty good, maybe 4. Yeah, 4 is actually pretty good. Again, this will always be accessible to us to adjust later on if we need to. And last adjustment that I want to make is you can see that these bricks right here, they're kind of flat. I want to kind of bring them out more, pushed forward. And we have this painted brick base color that we're using, and we still have height being used in this channel, but we're not using it. It's set to 0 right now. If I increase this, we are now adjusting the height of the brick mask itself and not the detail height for the painted brick we just created. So you can see that by adding an additional layer just for the detail on the brick itself, on the cinder block, we have 2 controls. One for the brick that we can push forward, and then we have the detail on the cinder block itself that we can also adjust individually. So let's do a painted, again, I am inside painted brick layer for the base color, where we have the base color adjustment as well as roughness. And now I can go ahead and just adjust it. Or let's do 0.15. And now we have that detail of the cinder blocks being pushed out. And then we have adjustments for painted brick height detail layer itself. And actually, let's adjust this name, painted brick detail height. And let's increase it maybe to 0.15. That's too much. Let's bring it back down to 0.1. All right, and now we have our painted cinder blocks. Now we need to create the grout information, the information between the cinder blocks. If we would have used the same height and the same information that we used for the cinder block, it would not look as good as if we treat this area individually, separate from the cinder blocks. And usually this area right here will have a slightly different grain and height information than the detail than the cinder blocks themselves. So that's what we want to do. For this, we're going to create a brand new folder. So this way we create the grout information within its own folder. So let's come back up to the layer stack, create a new folder. And it actually creates a folder inside another folder. Let me re-drag it on top, away from our painted bricks folder, and let's rename it. It's going to be named painted grout. And let's go ahead and call upon that anchor point right away. So that way we get to see the effect as soon as we begin to apply it. So for this folder, right click on the folder icon and create a black mask, and then right click on the black mask and create a fill. And inside this fill, under grayscale property, select it and switch over to anchor points and call upon this brick painted mask anchor point. And then we'll come back to it in just a second because we're gonna need to invert it. So let's go back into the folder and create the information for the grout. First is going to be a fill layer, and this fill layer is going to be called Grout Base or Grout Painted Base. Name it whatever you want. I want to use a very similar color that we used for the bricks. Right now it's actually applying it to everything, and it's actually applying it for the bricks themselves, for the cinder blocks, and not for the grout. But we'll come back to that and we'll invert it in just a second. I want to come back down into the painted bricks. Open this folder, go back to our painted brick base. Actually, let me rename it so I know what it is. It's a lot easier to find when it's properly named. And I want to grab this base color. I'm going to copy this number, this hex number, and you can actually, whatever color you have selected, you can add it to your swatches right here. So if I have this color selected, if I press the plus icon, it'll add it as my swatch to use. So this way I don't have to come back down and have to remember the hex number for the color or anything else. I'll have my swatches down below. Now let me come back up to our grout, to our base. And for the base color, I'm just going to use this, but I'm going to make it slightly darker, just a little bit. Now again, we are only applying this for the cinder blocks themselves and not for the grout. Let me just change the color drastically, something else. You can see that it's applying to the cinder blocks. I actually want to apply it to the grout itself. So to do this, you need to invert the anchor point. So let's come back to our black mask for the folder, to our fill where we have our anchor point, and under levels, let's open this up, and you are able to invert it. So this will take the mask, the anchor point that is calling on the brick painted mask, and it will invert it. And it will only apply it into the grout and not to the cinder blocks, and that's what we want. And now we can go ahead and see what everything we do within the painted grout folder and how it will apply only to the grout area. Alright, now we can go ahead and begin to adjust our grout painted base. Let's come back to the base color, choose our swatch, and I'm going to make it slightly darker, just a little bit, not too much. For the roughness, I'm going to keep it at the same value that we have for the brick painted, for the cinder blocks themselves. So that was 0.4, because again, the paint is applied to the entire surface, the in-between cinder blocks as well as the cinder blocks. So it's going to have the same roughness. This roughness might be different if you're creating more of a damaged cinder block and you need the separation and different roughness for the grout and the cinder blocks themselves. But in this painted version, it's going to have the same roughness across everything. Next, we need the height information detail for the in-between cinder blocks. Just like we do on the cinder blocks, but we need it in between. So for this, again, I don't want to do it inside the grout painted base layer. I want to have control within its own individual layer. So I'm going to create a fill layer. Let's do grout detail height. Create a black mask. And then inside this black mask, right click and create a fill. So we can go ahead and then inside this fill, input our own height. However, let me come back to the layer itself and disable the channels I don't want to use. And that is everything except for the height. Then let's go to the black mask, into the fill, and input a grayscale texture to use for the height. You can choose any of the grunge textures, the ones that you would want to use. Let's just input one so we can see the effect. And we're not going to see the effect. That's because we need to adjust the height for this layer, for the grout detail height, by going back into the height category and increasing this until we get to see the effect. So let's increase it right now to, let's say 0.1, and then we'll be able to lower it when we have the right grunge selected. I'm gonna go back into the black mask, into the fill, and I already have one selected that I decided to use. You can choose any of the ones that you would want, just go through the grunge textures. And the one I want to use is grunge concrete moss small. And let's go ahead and select it. Let's come back up, and I want to increase the tiling for this. Let's say 3, maybe 5. That's actually pretty good. And I want to lower the amount that we are using on this. Actually, let me increase it. Let me see what 10 would look like. Actually, maybe, yeah, let's go back down lower, 6. Let's come back up to the detail height. And I want to just take a look at different values. Let's go to 0.4, that's way too much. 0.1. Let's maybe lower it 0.08. Again, I want just a subtle effect. Let's go even lower, 0.05. And let's do the before and after by switching the layer visibility on and off. And I think that's pretty good. Let's adjust the color, because I think now it separates the paint a little too much. So I'm going to come back down to Grout Painted Base. Let's select our swatch. And again, just a little bit. Change it. Not as much as before. So at this point, we have everything set up. We just need to work with our roughness. And the roughness is going to come with how shiny or how dull this material is when light shines onto it. So if you move the light by holding down Shift, right click, hold, and get the angle right, just take a look at your surface. You can see that it's been very shiny across everything. We can go ahead and adjust the roughness for the base layers and lower. So this is grout. Let's come back down to the painted bricks into the painted brick base. So that way we can see a little bit better. And so we can adjust the roughness and make it more dull or make it more shiny. However, it's going to apply one solid value of 0.4 or whatever value you choose across the entire surface. And we need to break this up. We need to have variation of roughness and not a solid single value. And for this, we're going to create a brand new layer by coming back up into the layer stack above both of the folders at the very top. Create a new fill layer. And let's rename this to Roughness Variation. So with this roughness variation, I'm going to right click and add the black mask. And then inside this black mask, I'm going to add a fill. And then inside this fill, we're going to choose which grayscale texture we're going to use for the roughness to break this solid single value and add that roughness variation we want. And this kind of setup by creating a fill layer, creating a black mask, and add a fill effect into it, so then you get to choose which grayscale you want to use. Gives you a lot more control because now you can adjust the grayscale value, the texture itself, and the properties within it, as well as come back into the layer itself and then adjust whatever values you are adjusting here. In our case, for this roughness fill layer itself, we do not want to have any other channel other than roughness, because that's what we want to adjust. So this will allow me to adjust roughness here, as well as here within the fill effect for the grayscale texture. You have more control this way. And this is why we did the same thing for the height. You have more control when you are setting up your layer this way with a black mask and then a fill effect into that black mask. And you can adjust the grayscale texture properties as well as the height information for that layer itself. Very powerful. So let's come back up to our roughness variation, and I want to find the right grayscale texture. I already have one picked out, so I'm going to select the fill effect, come to the properties, choose the grayscale, and I'm going to type in the one that I already chose, which is grunge concrete paint leak. You can choose any of the grunge textures, the one that you kind of suitable for you for the cinder block roughness variation you'd want to use. So I'm going to input this grunge scale texture to use. Let's disable it on and off. Not much is changing. It's doing something, but not enough. We need to come back to the roughness variation layer itself, select it, so we get access to the roughness value. Right now it's set to 0.4, and just simply adjust this value right here and just crank it up or crank it down. In this case, I'm going to increase it, and you can see that we have some roughness variation. Just move the light, and let's increase it even further to, let's say, 0.7. And you can enable and disable roughness variation to see. So here's what it was before, and here it is after. And you have a few additional properties you can adjust for the grunge texture itself by going back into the fill effect, and you have balance and you have contrast. And again, to see the effect, you need to position the light and just look at your surface at the right angle and then begin to adjust the values. And that is how you add roughness variation. So at this point, our layers are done. Everything is set up. All you would need to do is come back through your layer by layer and make any adjustments you need to kind of finish everything else up. You can come back down to the brick painted mask and adjust the blur, the slow blur. You can even adjust the brick generator of how much the cinder blocks are tiling. So you can come back through any of these layers, adjust it to exactly what you would want your final result to be. And once you are done, once you are ready, you have a tileable texture to use for your painted cinder blocks. And your final step would be to take this and export your tiling seamless texture so you can use it inside Unreal Engine 5 or any other software or game engine of your choice. So let me show you how to export for Unreal Engine 4 or 5. So once you are done tweaking everything and you like how this looks and you're ready to export, go to File, Export Textures. And the first thing I want to point out, you may not have this unless you have a mannequin imported with your tile and plane. I have 2 texture sets, one for the mannequin, which I am not going to use or export any textures because that was just a scale reference to use. And here's the tile and plane that we were working with. So that's the one I'm going to make sure it's enabled. So I export the textures only for the tile and plane. Let me go back to the global settings. First, define output directory. Where do you want to save your textures into? If you need to change it, just simply left click on this and define a output directory. I already have mine set. Next, define output template. In my case, I'm going to use Unreal Engine 4 packed. Packed means it's going to take roughness, ambient occlusion, and metallic texture and pack it into a single texture into individual channel of that texture. It's going to save some memory instead of having 3 different textures. File type, PNG, 8-bit. Size is going to be set on based on my texture set size, which was 2K texture. Right here you can see it's 2048 by 2048. And the size that it's keeping that same size for my texture output, for the texture resolution to save. Padding is going to be set at default for dilation infinite. Not going to change that. Once these properties are set up, if you click on the tile and plane or on the texture set you are going to save and export for your textures, you can just kind of check what's going to be exported, all the settings we just defined here in the global settings, and then your output maps. And it's going to be color, metallic, roughness and ambient occlusion packed into one, and then normal map. And then you also have emissive. However, I disabled emissive because we don't have any emissive properties to export as a texture. And actually, if I had this enabled, nothing will be exported because we have no emissive channels. And once you're done, click export. And to check, here are our 3 textures. Here's the base color, here's the normal map, and here's the packed single texture for ambient occlusion, roughness, and metallic. And now you can take these 3 textures, import them into Unreal Engine 4 or 5, set up your material, and use this tiling, paint, and cinder block. If you enjoyed this tutorial, I have a more in-depth, extensive course on how to use Substance 3D Painter completely from scratch. It will show you everything you need to know to get started with Substance Painter in just 6 hours and across 23 videos. The course is called Substance 3D Painter Essentials. It's available right now, and you can begin to learn how to texture with Painter. And I'll see you in there.